Okay, Christy started for me. Perfect. So at this time, I want to introduce EEC, External Cause Codes. And Christy Pollard's going to be our presenter for today's webinar. And she is a senior consultant, and she has more than 20 years of industry experience. She's responsible for the development of the web-based, instructor-led training, and as well as conducting training in ICD-10, CM, PCS, and CPT coding. She also does performing some DRG and APC audits. Christy has an extensive background in coding education and consulting and is a national speaker on topics related to ICD-10 and CPT coding, as well as code-based reimbursement. And in her free time, and we laugh about that now that she has a baby, she does enjoy spending any extra time mentoring current and future coders through her Coder Coach blog, and she is the proud recipient of the 2011 AHIMA Triumph Award for Mentoring. So at this time, Christy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Kathy. And no barking dogs in my background today, but you might hear a cat later. She usually makes her appearance when I start talking. Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar on external cause codes. And when I heard that I was going to be doing a webinar on external cause codes, a big part of me went eek, because I haven't really done a lot of external cause coding since I was an ER coder. But the other part was I thought, how am I going to talk about this for an hour? And somehow I managed to find enough content for an hour and got really excited about the information that is going to be presented over the next several minutes. And I hope that you guys are excited about it too. So the things that we're going to go over today, first of all, we have kind of a comic book superhero theme today. I thought that that went well with our external causes. And we are going to talk about some of the basics, go through some of the coding guidelines. We'll talk about seventh characters a little bit. We will also talk about some of the common search terms for these external cause codes, because I know that a big part of the problem is how to find the code. There were a lot of external cause codes in ICD-9. There are 5 times as many in ICD-10, and that can look pretty intimidating. We are also going to talk about some of the uses for external cause code data, that if you think about how this data is being used, I think it can kind of help you in your code assignment. So first of all, going into external cause of injury codes, and we don't call them E-codes anymore. I think some people still call them E-codes, but now E-codes are endocrine. So these are codes that start with 4 different letters, and throughout this presentation I will be referring to them as ECI codes. And that's how they're referred to on the UB. It's an external cause of injury, but technically the chapter in ICD-10 is for external cause of injury and morbidity, and the codes are not limited to just being used with injuries. So the external cause codes provide data for injury research and for evaluation of injury prevention strategies, and we're going to take a closer look at what that means in the next couple of slides. But really what we're answering with all of these ECI codes is, you know, what is the cause? How did this injury or this condition occur? And why did it occur? Was it something that was an accident? Was it their homicidal or suicidal intent? Was there terrorism, which unfortunately is something that we have to consider more and more in our daily life now? And where did it occur? What was the patient doing at the time, or their activity? And who is that patient? What was their status at the time of the injury? Are they military? Were they on the job? Were they a student in school? We are able to answer all of these questions with our ECI codes. Now, before I really get into this, I do want to remind you that there is no national requirement for the use of ECI codes. These are found in Chapter 20 of ICD-10 CM, but there may be local mandates wherever you are. Now, you know, the one mandate that always comes to mind, because it gets a lot of press in California, is OSHPD. That's the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development, and they collect a lot of data for the state of California, and they require the reporting of ECI codes. Here in the state of Colorado, while the codes are not required, they do recommend that we report them to the Colorado Hospital Association, and we have a lot of data that goes to the Colorado Health Department that relies on our external cause of injury codes. So the reporting, even though it is not mandated, it is encouraged for injury research and prevention strategies. So if you're really only looking at coding for reimbursement, you may want to just, you're maybe thinking, ECI codes, I don't know, we don't really need to worry about it. But remembering that coding goes beyond reimbursement, and that data really is used to make decisions about our health and about injury prevention, then I think you can kind of see the need to be able to report this information. Here's just a little background information, and there was a presentation that was given by somebody at the Colorado Health Department, and she shared this information with me, but there was there's a history that goes back all the way to 1991, when the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics recommended that we include E-codes in the hospital discharge data sets. Now, I started coding in 1995, and I started coding ER charts, and that was at the time when we really started reporting data to the Colorado Hospital Association, or things kind of ramped up. And they were getting very concerned about missing E-codes, and I remember going to a presentation by the Colorado Health Department, and they were really encouraging us to use these codes. So by the year 2007, which was, wow, already 10 years ago, all but 5 states had hospital discharge data sets, and more than half of those states required E-codes to be routinely collected. And then, of course, in 2015, we moved from ICD-9 to ICD-10, and we have even more options of external cause codes, which have been the subject of much internet fodder, and even I've seen some things on TV when they were talking about how ridiculous ICD-10 was. They picked the most ridiculous ECI codes they could and said, look at what they have to code. And of course, these codes are not required, and how many times are we really going to see some of the really bizarre codes? Anyway, in case you're wondering where your data goes, this is what your external cause of injury data is being used for. First of all, your facility administration may be looking at it to assess quality as well as organizational improvement. They may be particularly interested in any place of occurrence codes that are within the hospital, with a POA indicator of N, indicating that that was not a condition that was present on admission. That can help your facility administration in identifying areas where they can improve patient safety. For payers, particularly workers' comp and auto insurers, are more likely to be looking at your external cause of injury codes to see exactly how the injury occurred. Your legislators may use it to inform their policy decision making and help obtain funding and measure progress. And then public health informants and advocates may also be using this data, and again, really with a focus on injury prevention. So the codes. This is why I call them ECI codes. It's a lot easier to say an ECI code than a VWXY code. Remember that what were E-codes now span 4 different letters of the alphabet. And I like to kind of categorize these, and this is, kind of a generalization, but your V codes include your transport and your vehicle accidents. So V is for vehicle. The W codes, these are what I call the what was I thinking codes, for the W, what was I thinking? Slipping, tripping, stumbling, and falls and exposures. That's, you know, here in Colorado, we code a lot of slip and falls on the ice. That would be captured with the W codes. You know, accidental cut by a knife, I believe, is within the W codes as well. The X codes, X for exposure and contact with fire, self-harm, and overexertion. There's kind of a lot of extra injury codes there in the X codes. And then the Y codes, which I had to think of something for the letter Y, so you know, it's just the rest. Y is you. The assault, medical complications, and all of your places and activity codes are found in the codes that begin with the letter Y. And we are going to go through all the individual sections of external cause codes, and you know, I'll give you a little bit of instruction on some of those individual codes. Now, there are 4 types of ECI codes that we deal with, and I have this weighted with the cause and intent of injury and illness on the left side because that's really the main cause of that injury. That is what we call the primary external cause code. The primary external cause code doesn't just tell you what happened, but the intent of that. Was it an accident? Was it self-harm, or was it inflicted harm from somebody else? Now, the secondary external cause codes are not as critical, I would say, because they're not telling us what happened, but they're telling us where it happened, the place of occurrence, what the patient was doing at the time. And I think that those are some of the most fun codes because you can really get into some interesting ones. I think we've all seen the, you know, the patient walked into a lamppost while texting. There's a code for that. And there is a code for being on a cell phone while you are injured. And I would love to see some of the statistics on that one. We also have the status codes that I mentioned earlier. You know, what was the patient, what was their status? Were they military? Were they working? Were they volunteering? Were they a student? So the guidelines, they're boring. I get it. I admit it. I wish that they would just let me rewrite the coding guidelines in a pictorial fashion to make them more fun and interesting. Of course, then I probably would be out of a job because those would be out there for everybody to see. But the coding guidelines for ECI codes are found in section 1.c.20. If you're an ER coder, if you work for a trauma facility, if you do any coding that involves a lot of ECI reporting, you need to be very familiar with these coding guidelines. And at the very least, you need to know what's in there so you can refer back to them for more details should you come across something where you're not quite sure about reporting or sequencing. So let's talk about the primary ECI codes to start with. And the first coding guideline says that these codes are to be used with any code in the A00.0 to T88.9 or Z00 to Z99 categories. In other words, you can use these ECI codes with any other code in the code book except for another ECI code. So the letters of the alphabet that they've excluded from this code range are external cause codes. And that means that if you have a patient who's coming in and there is a documented cause of morbidity that it's not an injury, you can still assign an external cause code. And probably the best example of that is nosocomial conditions. There is an external cause code for a nosocomial condition that would be appropriate to report if the patient had a healthcare associated infection. There is also a guideline that talks about using the appropriate 7th character. Now, the primary ECI codes have 7th characters to describe the encounter of care. It's either A, D, or S, and that should be matching your primary injury code. So you've got a patient who comes in with an arm fracture and this is their first episode of care, then you're going to use your A 7th character for initial on your injury code and your external cause code. So if they fell down the stairs, then your fall down the stairs would have a 7th character of A. They also say to use the full range and as many external cause codes as necessary. And that can be a little tricky because some of the codes are difficult to find, and sometimes you're not really sure how many you should be coding. So we will talk a little bit about this in some more detail. They also say to use the external cause, injury, and tabular to select codes. I mean, we all know that coding begins with the index and ends once you look that up in the tabular. But don't forget that the ECI index is separate from the main PCS, or sorry, wow, I went to PCS. We're not doing PCS today. The ICD-10-CM index of injuries. It also says to never use external cause codes as first listed diagnosis, and I think we're all pretty much aware of that. I've not seen anybody try to use an external cause code as primary, and you're going to get all kinds of bells and whistles that come up and edits saying, oop, you can't do that. There's also a coding guideline that says that no external cause is needed if another code covers the cause and the intent. And an example of that is our poisoning codes. Poisoning codes are now T codes, and the T code actually includes the intent, whether it was accidental, intent to self-harm, or intent to harm somebody else. And that leads us to our first polling question. Kathy, would you run us through the poll, please?
Absolutely. On your screen now is our first power poll of the day. An external cause code should be assigned in addition to poisoning codes. Is that true or false? So what do you think? An external cause code should be assigned in addition to poisoning codes. Is it true or false? And I'm looking over and we've got responses coming in. This group was pretty awake today. I think it was because of my barking dog started us off this morning, Christy. But I've got them coming in. Anybody else want to weigh in? Okay, I'm going to close the poll. Here's your last chance. 3, 2, 1. Christy, we've got overwhelming response. 100% of our audience is saying the answer is false.
So apparently our audience has had their coffee for the day, and this answer is correct. So it is false. The poisoning codes include the intent, so there is no reason to add an external cause code. All right, thank you, Kathy. If you'll bring us back to the presentation. Oh, you're so quick. All right, combination codes. There is a guideline about combination codes that describe sequential events, and these have always confused me. You know, how do you code these? If the patient fell and hit their head, do you code it the same as if they hit their head and then fell? And what the guideline says is that the injury may be due to either or both events, but the code should correspond to the sequence of the events, not the most serious injury. So the example here, this one sounds a little embarrassing to admit when you come to the doctor, but concussion due to hitting head on the wall after falling off the toilet. And the code for that is W18.12XA, fall from or off toilet with subsequent striking against object initial encounter. And you gotta love the coding terminology that they use for this. And what we're really trying to get across with the external cause codes, don't forget we're trying to tell a story. We're trying to explain to anyone reading the data, whether it be an insurance company or somebody at the health department or OSHPD if you're in California or wherever else, that we want to be able to try to tell the patient's story with those codes without them having to go and dig through the chart for additional information. Now moving beyond the ECI, the primary ECI codes, and getting into some of those secondaries, the first one that we really think of is place of occurrence codes. And when I started coding E-codes, we were really focused on the cause of injury, and I kind of remember place of occurrence being the next one that came along, I don't remember assigning activity and status codes when I was coding ERs, and I don't know if that's because they didn't exist or if it just wasn't a big focus at the time because they were really just starting to ramp up their collection of data. But with the place of occurrence codes, this describes where the patient was at the time of the injury. Again, it isn't a secondary external cause code, so if you don't have your primary cause of injury, there's no reason to code this place of occurrence code. And you assign this only once for the initial encounter for treatment, which means that if let's say you have a patient coming in for physical therapy because the patient broke his arm playing soccer on the soccer field at school. Well, since the patient is getting physical therapy for an injury that is healing, we are not going to assign the place of occurrence code. And the big old clue here is that there are no seventh characters for place of occurrence codes. There is no place for you to add an A for initial or a D for subsequent or an S for sequela. So I always tell people if there is no seventh character for that code to describe the encounter, do not code it other than on that first initial encounter. And there's also a guideline that says you only assign one place of occurrence code per case unless another injury occurs during the encounter. And there are places for you to indicate the present on admission indicator, and that would be an important thing here probably, as I mentioned earlier, to your hospital administration so that they can identify accidents that are occurring while the patient is in-house. There's also a coding guideline that says not to use Y92.9 for unspecified place if the place is not documented. And I, for one, find this absolutely ridiculous. Why have a code if we have a coding guideline that says never to use that code? I will tell you that in the past, I've worked for facilities that did want to code this code because they wanted to make sure that it was really a documentation issue and not a coding issue. But that's very facility driven, and just know that there is a coding guideline that tells you where not to assign the unspecified place if it's not documented. A couple of examples of place of occurrence codes: Y92.210 for daycare center. There's one for patient room in a hospital, and there is an unspecified place of residence, Y92.009, that's just home, not otherwise specified. But the home codes get pretty ridiculous. I mean, it gets into whether the patient lives in an apartment or a single-family dwelling and which room of the house they were in. And while that may seem like a great thing to be able to say, you know, there are so many injuries that happen in the kitchen in an apartment, I just don't think we're ever going to see that level of detail. And if you do, I mean, that's great, but that can be kind of nitpicky. Now the activity codes. Oh, these are the fun ones. These are the ones that say what the patient was doing at the time of the injury. And again, a secondary external cause code. This one is also assigned only for the initial, once for the initial encounter for treatment. Activity codes do not have seventh characters to specify the encounter that is for which the patient is being presented. So you are only going to code these on the initial encounter, which means that they are not applicable to adverse effects, they are not applicable to misadventures or sequela. You do not want to assign code Y93.9 for unspecified activity. And again, why have a code if we can't use it? I would say just eliminate the code completely from the code system, but that's just me. There is an other specified activity, which is different from the unspecified. And a couple of examples here: you can injure yourself while running, which is likely. You can injure yourself while cooking and baking. I can't tell you how many times I burned myself taking something out of the oven. And you can injure yourself on a roller coaster. And these, again, just a couple of examples of activities. And there are activities for many things. You can see a lot of different things here. You can get attacked by a dog. There could be some kind of construction injury. There are even activity codes for using some sort of computer equipment at the time, using tools, walking, hiking, running, skiing, gardening, playing a musical instrument, childcare, all kinds of different things. So that is going to bring us to our next polling question. Kathy?
Okay. On your screen, here's the question. Activity codes should be assigned only once at the initial encounter for treatment. Do you think that's true, false, or you don't know? So what do you think? Christy was just talking about activity codes. Activity codes should be assigned only once at the initial encounter for treatment. Is that true, false, or I don't know? We've got responses trickling in. If you're in a large group setting, kind of poll your group, and based on the majority, go ahead and choose a answer for us. What do you think? True, false, or I don't know? Okay, responses are slowing down. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Christy, we've got everybody is all together again on this answer. We've got 100% of our audience is saying this is true.
I guess I'm going to have to make my questions harder, Kathy, because everybody's getting these. This one is, yes, it is true. So the activity codes, again, they don't have 7th characters, so we're only going to assign them once for that initial encounter. All right, Kathy, thank you for the poll. And let's move on to status codes. And we got our little army guy here. This really describes the patient's work status at the time of injury. That is the purpose of this. And it is a secondary external cause code. It cannot stand alone as the external cause code. So you should not be assigning these Y99 codes on every single patient who walks in the door just to say, hey, this patient was working at the time. There needs to be a primary external cause of injury code that goes along with it. These are also not applicable to poisonings, adverse effects, misadventures, or late effects. And like the place of occurrence and activity codes, we're going to assign the status code only once for the initial encounter of treatment. And, you know, once again, we are never to use code Y99.9 for unspecified external cause status if it's unspecified. And again, if somebody could please explain to me why we have a code in the code book and then a guideline that says that we can't use that code, I would love to know. I think it's really that as coders, when we created this system, we felt like we had to have an other specified and an unspecified for every single code category, and that may be it. The codes that are shown here these are the entire list of codes for status. There's really not a whole lot. So you can see what they're really trying to capture. Civilian activity done for income or pay. This one might be really important to a workers' comp case. And if you do have a case that is workers' comp and it's documented that the patient was working at the time, I would advise picking this one up just in case the insurance company requires that. The code Y99.1 for military activity is something that is probably going to be a bigger deal in areas where you have a local military base. And then, of course, we've got volunteer activities, and there's a long list under code Y99.8 for other external cause status. So if you are limited on space, there are coding guidelines that tell you what you need to do. Now, if you're reporting codes on the UB04, there are 3 specific fields on the UB that correspond to ECI codes. So they don't actually go in with your other diagnosis codes. They kind of get pulled out and put into these ECI fields on the UB. And as far as, you know, additional codes, I I think they just don't get reported on the UB, or maybe they get tacked on to the end of your others. Now, if you're limited on space, and I don't know a whole lot of hospitals that put conditions on reporting ECI codes, but if you are not able to report all of them, you want to assign the ECI code most closely related to the principal diagnosis. And additional primary ECI codes should be used over the place, activity, and status codes. So if you can't fit something on the claim or something in your system, make sure you're at least pulling all of your primary external cause codes. You may have 1, 2, or possibly even 3 primary external cause codes that take precedence over those others. For sequelae, and sequelae are late effects. These are conditions that are the result of a previous disease or injury that has completely healed. So you'll see the green check mark on the left says use for any report of a late effect resulting from a previous injury that is being treated, and you report that code with the 7th character of S for sequela. Again, we're talking about primary ECI codes here because your place of occurrence, activity, and status codes do not get reported on sequelae. And you do not want to use your sequela codes with a related current nature of an injury, and do not use for subsequent visits for follow-up care when there is no late effect. So this is really going beyond the initial treatment, obviously, and the healing phase. The condition is healed, and now they're coming back with something else. So an example of this would be a patient coming in for surgery for a septal deviation due to sequela from a nasal fracture after being hit in the face with a soccer ball several years ago during soccer practice at school. And this would be coded as your deviated septum is the primary diagnosis. That's really what the patient is presenting with today. But it is a late effect of a fracture of the nasal bones. And you can see we've got the S code with the 7th character of S showing that this is a sequela. And then we have our W code for struck by a soccer ball, and that is the sequela. Now, having said that, if you get this level of documentation on a sequela chart, I will be impressed. Usually the physician will say it's a septal deviation and won't really go into much more detail than that, but it's an example that I used. You will notice that even though we have documentation that this happened while the patient was playing soccer, during soccer practice at school, we have a place of occurrence, we have an activity, but this is a sequela, and we only assign those codes on the primary visit, so we do not have any additional codes for this case. I wanted to take a moment and address non-physician documentation for your external cause of injury. And there is a coding clinic from first quarter of 2014 that says that non-physician documentation may be used because, let's face it, it's usually going to be the nurse who pulls that kind of detail. It may even be coming from an ambulance trip report or an EMT report if the patient came in through the ER. What Coding Clinic says is that you use only the documentation from the official medical record, and that's the terminology they use, official medical record. And my interpretation of that is the official medical record is the legal medical record. If it is documented in the legal medical record, then you can pull information from that to code from. But you may want to talk to your facility management to determine what exactly is included in your legal medical record. They may or may not consider a trip report, which is from before the patient was admitted to the hospital, part of your official medical record. So if you're not sure within your facility, I would ask just to make sure that you're absolutely certain. A couple of additional things about primary external cause of injury codes. There is a hierarchy, and you hope that you never have to use this hierarchy. You really hope that all of the cases that you code are just accidents, you know, things happening from people falling down the stairs or cutting themselves while they're cutting up vegetables for dinner or something along those lines. But unfortunately, the reality is that there things like child and adult abuse and terrorism exist. And so there is an external cause hierarchy. At the very top of that hierarchy, the codes that trump all other codes are the child and adult abuse codes. And that is followed by terrorism events, which is followed by cataclysmic events. Those are your tornadoes and hurricanes and all the crazy things that we've been hearing about lately. I'm sure that this hierarchy is being used quite a bit in Texas and in Florida with the recent hurricanes. The transport accidents come after that, and then finally your activity and status codes. And this really is referring to sequencing. So here is a sequencing example. We have a patient who presented with a broken left clavicle, and he was running in the Boston Marathon on the street when the Boston bombing took place, and he fell into a drain, and he is an avid hobby runner. And here are your codes. So the very first thing is your fracture code, obviously. That's why the patient is presenting. But we now have a bombing, which was due to terrorism, and that code is going to be sequenced first. And then you're going to have the fall into the storm drain or manhole. Then you've got your place of occurrence, you've got the activity he was running at the time, and his other external cause status. All right, Kathy, this brings us to our third power poll.
Okay. So the question is, which external cause codes should be sequenced before the others? Terrorism events, child and adult abuse, or transport accidents? So what do you think? Which external cause codes should be sequenced before the others? Is it terrorism, child and adult abuse, or transport accidents? And I think this goes back to the hierarchy that Christy just mentioned. So we've got responses still trickling in. Anybody else having some discussion back at your place of work? Let us know. What do you think? External cause code should be sequenced before the other. Is it terrorism, child and adult abuse, or transport accidents? Okay, I'm going to close the poll, so it's your last chance to throw out an answer. I'm going to close it in 3, 2, 1. Christy, we've got 100% of the audience is saying the answer is child and adult abuse.
And again, 100% are correct. The child and adult abuse codes trump everything else when it comes to sequencing, and I really do think I'm going to have to spice up my questions, make them a little tougher for you. All right, Kathy, thank you very much. And let's talk a little bit more about child and adult abuse, because I know that there has been some confusion on when to assign a perpetrator code, because there is a code to describe who the perpetrator is. So there are adult and child abuse codes for suspected and confirmed cases of abuse. And T74 is the category that we use for confirmed cases. And when you have a confirmed case of adult or child abuse, there is a code also note to use an additional code Y07 for the perpetrator of that assault. And then you code the associated injury, and then you code the cause of that injury. So you'll notice that the abuse code is not an ECI code. So I find it very interesting that we've got this coding guideline that is in the Chapter 20 coding guidelines that says that we sequence our child abuse child and adult abuse code first, but it's not actually an ECI code. It's a T code that's found in Chapter 19 for our injuries. For the suspected cases of child abuse, those go to category T76, and then you code the associated injury and the cause of injury if specified, but you do not assign a code for the perpetrator. So it is very specific that we only use a code from Y07 if the perpetrator or if the abuse is confirmed. So let's look at an example. We have a 12-year-old patient who presented to the ED with complaints of a second-degree cigarette burn of the left forearm due to confirmed abuse by his stepfather. And this sounds like a nice, clean example. Unfortunately, I think the reality is we can't tell from the documentation. Usually there hasn't been a full investigation, and they're just not sure at the time that the patient is there whether this is confirmed or not. But in this case, we've got the T74.12XA, child abuse, and it's physical. It's been confirmed, and this is an initial visit. We have the stepfather as the perpetrator. We have a T code for the second-degree burn, and then the X code for exposure to other specified smoke, fire, and flames for the cigarette burn. The terrorism guidelines, you know, this is something that in the past I have really just kind of glossed over because I thought, oh, terrorism is something that happens in the Middle East. It's not something that happens here. And unfortunately, over the last several years, that's been proven to be completely untrue and inaccurate. The thing that you need to know is that the FBI does have a definition of terrorism, and it is found in the notes at the beginning of category Y38. So if you're ever watching the news, the national news, when something happens and they say, oh, well, the FBI is not calling it terrorism yet, there really truly is a definition of what terrorism is. And those are unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objective. And this is something else where I'm just not sure at the time that we're coding this if we will really know, if it will be confirmed that it is a terrorist related event. And I would love to hear from you guys if that's something that you ever see, if you've ever had anything in your area where that it's been an issue. But I suspect that we just don't know at the time that we're coding. Now, we do, with the terrorism, we do use an additional code for the place of occurrence. You can use more than one code from category Y38 if it applies. And suspected terrorism, so if it hasn't been confirmed, is coded as assault. You need to be very careful with your documentation here. There's also a category for secondary effects of terrorism, Y38.9, conditions that occur subsequent to the terrorist event, and may be assigned with other codes from Y38 if there's also an injury due to the initial terrorist event. With the Y38.9 subcategory, it is further broken down to identify whether it was a public safety official or a civilian who was injured. So hopefully you won't see a ton of child abuse and terrorism charts, but I have a feeling you'll see a ton of car accidents. And the types of, I mean, car accidents are so prevalent, and trying to get this data is so prevalent that the entire letter V is dedicated to transport accidents. So codes V00 to V99 are your transport or vehicle accidents. And a couple of things about your car accidents. First of all, there are notes at the beginning of chapter 20, and this is something that I kind of glossed over before and didn't really realize that there was a specific code for airbag injury. How many times do you see a patient coming into the ED and they were in a car accident, but it wasn't the car accident that injured them, it was the airbag. So do make sure that you are aware that this code exists. Also, they do say to code the type of street or road the patient was on at the time. There are codes in category Y92.4 that specify whether they were on an interstate or a state a street or a highway. It gets extremely specific. And then this one's my favorite. I would love to see the data on this one. How many people were using a telephone at the time, a cell phone, or other electronic equipment at the time they were in their car accident? The notes at the beginning of chapter 20 also describe definitions related to transport accidents. This is important. If you aren't sure what kind of a vehicle a sport utility vehicle is classified as, it's in those definitions. If you're not sure what a transport versus a non-transport accident is, it's in those definitions. Same thing with definitions of public highway and traffic and non-traffic accidents. There are all kinds of definitions associated with our V codes here. Make sure that you are aware of those definitions and how to use them. I think that car accidents are probably the most difficult thing that there is to code, and is probably the thing that we code the most frequently when it comes to ECI coding. So this is kind of my mental checklist that I go down, and it follows the logic in the index. And if you have a logic encoder, this is one of the few places, I think if you know me, you know that I'm not a huge fan of encoders because I think it can lead you down a wrong pathway if you don't really know what you're doing, or if you're not really in tune with the book. But this is one of the places where I think I would prefer a logic encoder because it's going to ask you all of these questions. So what was the patient's mode of transportation? What were they in, or were they walking or whatever when they were in their accident? So they were either a pedestrian, they were in a car, and if it was a car, what kind of car? All kinds of other things. So what was the patient's role in that mode of transport? If they were in a car, were they the driver or were they a passenger? That is going to make a difference in your code assignment. Was there a collision? Because our accidents differentiate between collision and non-collision accidents. And if there was not a collision, was it a traffic or a non-traffic accident? Now, the default to that is traffic. So if they don't tell you, you assume that it was a traffic accident. And again, what's the difference between a traffic and a non-traffic accident? Those definitions are at the beginning of the chapter. And then there are a couple of extras. Is the street type documented? Can you code that place of occurrence to a specific type of street? Was there an airbag injury? Was the patient using a cell phone at the time? So a transport accident example. We have a 23-year-old patient admitted with nasal and sternum fractures after being injured by the airbag when it deployed into his face and chest. He was driving a late model SUV when he rear-ended a semi-truck on I-25, and he was texting during the accident. So you can see our little sad broken phone down at the bottom here. We've got codes for the fracture of the sternum and the nasal bones. We have the code for being struck by an airbag. We have the code, look at how specific our V code is. Driver of a pickup truck or van injured in a collision with a heavy transport vehicle or bus in traffic accident. How do I know this was a pickup truck? Because the coding guidelines at the beginning of chapter 20 tell me that an SUV is classified as a pickup truck. They also tell me that these big semis are classified as a heavy transport vehicle. We also have a code for Y92.411, interstate highway, as the place of occurrence for our external cause code, and our our activity saying that the patient was using a handheld electronic device at the time. This is information that I think would be interesting to all of us to see what the prevalence is of accidents with people using their phones. I don't know that we get this level of documentation in our medical records, but wouldn't it be awesome if we were able to pull this kind of data and show how detrimental it is to use cell phones while you're driving. Okay, other external causes of accidental injury. The RW codes, you can see we've got a lot of people here who just slipped and fell on a wet floor. So the slipping, tripping, stumbling, and falls are codes W00 to W19. The exposure to inanimate mechanical forces are classified to W20 to W49, and that includes all kinds of things from being struck by an object to being caught or crushed between objects, machinery accidents, handgun accidents, accidental explosions, needle sticks. These are all accidental things. So if you see the title of this slide is Other External Causes of Accidental Injury, because we have several similar codes, but some of them are for accidents, some of them are self-inflicted injury, and some of them are classified as assault, where somebody else has inflicted the injury. More accidental ECI codes: exposure to animate mechanical forces, struck by people, being crushed in a crowd, so a mosh pit at a concert, that would be classified in this category. Accidental non-transport, drowning and submersion, exposure to electric currents and radiation, and extreme ambient air temperature and pressure, and all kinds of different things. I've got ZAP listed there. You know, it sounds kind of funny when you look at it, but it is not funny if this stuff happens to you. So yeah, I had to make the presentation a little more exciting. Even more accidental ECI codes. It's the W00s that extend into the X58s. And this includes exposure to smoke and fire and flames, contact with heat and hot substances, exposure to forces of nature, excessive heat and cold, earthquakes, avalanche, cataclysmic storms. X50 is one of our favorites, I think. I don't know about you, but this was one I was coding all the time as an ER coder. The patient twisted their ankle. So the X50 includes all of your overexertion and strenuous or repetitive movements. And then you've got your X52 to X58 codes, which are accidental exposure to other specified factors. All kinds of stuff for accidents. Now, why am I going through this? Why am I going through every single section that's in here? Because how are you going to use a code if you don't even know it exists? And I have to say that the index for external cause of injury codes is rather poorly written. I'm not a big fan. I think it was kind of a mess in ICD-9, and then we have twice as many codes in ICD-10, and so now it's a hot mess, and it's really difficult to find the codes. I do recommend that you go through and read, yes, read all through the chapter. First of all, I normally wouldn't recommend that you do that because it'd be boring as all get out. But these codes are kind of fun, as we all know, that, you know, isn't there one for running into a lamp post? Which again is funny until it happens to you, and then it's really not that funny. But these codes, if you read through the chapter, you'll get an idea of the kinds of codes that are out there. If you know a code exists, you're more likely to look for it and, you know, take the time to really find it. The intentional ECI code. So there are two different types. There are the intentional self-harm, X71 to X73. This is purposefully inflicted injury, suicide attempts, and that is included in the section notes at the beginning of X71. So don't forget to go back and look at all of your section notes as well as all of your category notes, subcategory and code level notes for a particular code. Assault codes are classified to X92 to Y09. This does include, it says homicide. Well, if the patient's dead, then we're not going to be coding a bill, although I guess they could be admitted and then die. But homicidal intent, injuries inflicted by another person with intent to injure or kill by any means. And there are a couple of excludes notes here. It excludes injuries due to operations of war, and it also excludes injuries due to terrorism. Your other ECI code sections, we do have an entire code section dedicated to events of undetermined intent, where the physician specifically says, I don't know if this was accidental or if it was suicidal or if it was assault. We have codes for legal intervention operations of war, military operations, and terrorism. And that does include legal interventions, or legal interventions includes encounters with law enforcement, which is something that we're seeing more and more as well. And you're more likely to be assigning these codes than I think we were 10, 20 years ago. We have in our little teal box here complications of medical and surgical care in Y62 to Y84. That includes complications of your devices and abnormal reactions to your procedures, as well as misadventures. And then finally, in the Y90 to Y99, we kind of have the rest of the external cause codes that include blood alcohol level, place of occurrence, activity, and nosocomial infections. So the unknown or undetermined intent, I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about the difference between that. The codes can look kind of similar, but they're classified to different sections. Remember that unspecified, there is a coding guideline that says that if an injury is unspecified, we assume it is accidental. And the example I've given here is W34.00, accidental discharge from an unspecified firearm or gun. That is different from undetermined, where the physician's not sure if this was intentional or if it was accidental. Maybe they think maybe the patient was trying to commit suicide, or maybe they think that the neighbor was trying to kill the patient. Then undetermined codes to Y24.9, unspecified firearm discharge, undetermined intent. And just notice how the guideline that I was telling you about that says that unspecified codes to accidental, how it can impact data interpretation. We can't code it to assault unless it's been documented. The same injury by a handgun, if done by assault, is coded to X93, which is very different. And the issue did come up early this year on the record of the wife of the New Orleans Saints football player Will Smith. So he and his wife received gunshot injuries, and he was killed. His wife was injured and went to the hospital. And in court, the defense attorney used the external cause code, saying that she suffered from an accidental gunshot wound, and to say that, you know, this was an accident. The doctor said it was an accident. And they put the doctor on the stand, and the doctor said, this isn't a doctor's thing, it's a coding error. That was what he said. And it's just interesting to see how looking at that code and knowing what the guidelines are affects the interpretation of that code further down the line. They should have called a coder to the stand to say, here's the coding guideline that says if the doctor doesn't say, it codes to unspecified. So look at what our codes do. Look at the impact that our codes have. I think in the interest of time, we're going to skip this polling question, but the last power poll, the question is, if the documentation for the intent is unspecified, it should be coded as accidental. The correct answer here is accidental. A couple of things about misadventures while we wrap up our presentation today. Misadventures to patients during surgical and medical care, the definition is an adverse event. And these are things that shouldn't happen. As a matter of fact, these are things that Medicare calls never events because they should never happen. Things like failure of sterile precautions, incorrect dosages, leaving sponges inside patients or other devices inside patients, not giving the patient care when they should have had care. And my recommendation, make sure that your hospital administration and risk management is on board with the use of these codes. Remember that Chapter 20 codes are optional, and most facilities that I have worked with have a policy not to use these misadventure codes. They feel like it's just a red flag that's going on the claim pointing to an issue. So you can elect not to use these codes, but I would make sure that you've got administration on board with that. There are codes for medical devices associated with adverse incidents in diagnostic and therapeutic use, and this is more, breakdown or malfunction of the medical device. And these don't seem to be as critical and as big of a red flag for the facility. They could potentially be a red flag for a manufacturer. Again, I would develop a facility policy on whether or not these codes are to be assigned in addition to your complication codes. A couple of other ECI codes that we tack on to the end. As I mentioned earlier, there's a code Y95 for nosocomial condition, and it is used for a documented healthcare acquired condition. There's a question about that in Coding Clinic 2013, fourth quarter. And I knew this code existed, and then I couldn't remember that it was an ECI code, and I was looking for it in the regular index. So just remember that you will find this code in the index to external causes, code Y95, nosocomial condition. We also have codes for blood alcohol level Y90, and there is a note before that to code first any associated alcohol-related disorders from category F10. This isn't something that we're just going to report out of the blue. There should be some type of intoxication or alcoholism associated with that in order to code that. And this is just providing supplementary information on the patient. One of the last things that I wanted to present to you are a couple of tips. So here are some indexing tips for ECI codes. If you're trying to decide where to look in the code book and what the main term is, I have included a table here that just points out some of those. I think the injury by animal are the ones that really kind of make my eyes roll. It's like, look at how many things we have to look under, how many ways you can be injured by an animal. We also have a lot of different entries for sports injuries. So take a look at these. If you're having trouble locating your ECI codes in the index, that might help. So a couple of other tips and tricks for your reporting. Make sure you're reading through the tabular list of external cause codes. I would take the time to do it, especially if you're an ER coder or you're coding for a trauma facility where you get a lot of these ECI codes. Remember the default coding guideline. That default code is listed next to the main term in the index when you don't have additional detail. So it may not fit your injury specifically, but remember defaults. Also remember the uses of the data. When I'm trying to decide, should I code this code or should I code that code, I'm trying to think, how will this data be used? What are they going to want to know on the back end? Are they going to want to, do I have the codes that I need to help tell this patient's story? And make sure you have, if documented, the primary external cause code, place of occurrence, activity, and the patient status. The 7th character for your primary ECI code should match your injury code. If you have an initial encounter, all of your 7th characters should be initial. And remember that there are similar ECI codes with different intent, whether it be accidental, self-harm, assault, or undetermined, like we saw on that gunshot wound slide a little bit earlier. So those are my recommendations for external cause coding. I'm not sure if we have time for questions. Kathy, do we have time for questions today?
We do not, but if anyone has any questions, feel free and either email myself or Christy or at the Haugen Group, and we will address those and send those out as a follow-up, kind of an FAQ document, if you will. So Christy, any final words from you?
No final words from me. Just thank you everyone so much for joining us today. I hope you found this webinar useful.
Perfect. Thank you, Christy, so much. And I just want to remind everybody, next month's webinars we have for the Profi side of the house, we've got billing for preventative visit and sick visit. And then on November 28th, we have OPPS for you facility coders. So we want to thank everyone for your time today. You will receive a short survey as soon as we close out of today's presentation that we ask you to take just a couple minutes and fill out. And then give us 48 hours. We will send a follow-up email. In that follow-up email will be the recording for today's presentation as well as the CEU certificates. So thank you very much. Thanks for your time and go have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.